Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Walker, and I'm so happy to be with you all today for the third regular meeting of the Healthcare Workforce Commission. Before we begin with today's agenda, I'll take a brief roll call of the commission members who are present today, either in person or on the line. So commission members, if you can please respond after I read your name. Scott Bulkey. Mary Chapman. Mary Chapman. Debbie Dalton. Sherry Danello. Janae Dock. Janae Dock. Clark Hill. Sean Little. Kaylee Noggle.
Present.
Sally Perry. Pete Quinones. Rick Roach. Rick Roach. Scott
Here.
Steiner. We have you, Mr. Roach. Thank you. Tanya Sudia.
Present.
Jean Sumner.
Present.
Courtney Terwilliger. Janae Dock. Janae Dock. And Mary Chapman. Mary Chapman. All right, thank you, Commissioner members, for that. I will make a note that this meeting is open to the public. And while we appreciate your attendance, if members of the public would like to make comment or have any questions about the material covered today, we ask that you submit those comments to the Commission's inbox at hcwf.commission@dch.ga.gov. All right, and one last comment, Commission members and who are present today, if you would like to speak, please let me know so I can unmute your microphones from the panel, and then you'll be able to speak. All right, and with that being said, I'll turn it over to Chair Noggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, thanks to Sean Walker of our team. We would not be here today or at this point in this effort if it were not for her. I know that you guys have all, she's kept us all up to speed and communicated a lot along the way. And so just want to extend my thanks and all of our gratitude for her work today. We're not quite done yet, though. Before we jump into today's agenda, I want to introduce a special guest that we have with us today. Brad Bohannon is the Director of Policy and External Affairs for Governor Kemp, who was unable to join us today, but want to invite him to share a few remarks with us before we jump in today. Brad, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I don't want to delay the important work of the commission, but I did just want to stop briefly and say thank you on behalf of the governor and the entire office for your service on this commission. The governor referenced in the April EO that established this commission that there are challenges in the hiring and retention of healthcare workers. We certainly understand that that is not a quick and easy fix, and that's why we so appreciate your time to be a part of this commission, to take time away from the important work that you do day to day in your communities across the state to look at ways to tackle this issue. So we greatly appreciate that. We look forward to the report and the recommendations and getting to work on those very soon. And then just thank you to the commissioner and the department as well for leading on this issue and leading these meetings. So just wanted to come by and thank you all again for your time and your service and the work that you're doing. So appreciate that very much.
So we'll jump in today. We've got a fairly full agenda and some materials to review today. I think you hopefully all received draft copies yesterday or over the weekend of where we are. So little recap, we kicked off officially with our first conversation in July, met in person in August. We invited public comment in both September, October, and then we met really recently in the last 2 weeks in November down in Savannah. And we're in the home stretch of finalizing this document with some final recommendations. I don't know if we can move that chat box up there, but we're working on it. So thank you for all the work we've done thus far, for your time and your talents and your input and feedback. Good afternoon. And we took what we heard, which I thought was a really, really healthy conversation in Savannah and really robust dialogue that I really enjoyed, and try to further synthesize that into a couple of really big buckets and then some specifics in each one of those buckets. And then we have 60 pages worth of case studies, extra data, ideas, and options, even beyond that. So what we'll focus on today is to see, have we reached alignment on our big top, 2 or 3 areas that we can tackle, which I feel like maybe we're there, but then the specifics in each one of those, and then talk about those for a moment. And if there's any that we want to go a bit further on and actually provide even one layer deeper of maybe specific language or very specific recommendation, if we want to hand it over to someone if they so decide to do something with. So we'll jump in. And yep, I did that. So this is going to be an interesting room in this technology. Sean and I are going to try to keep pace with one another. So areas for improvement. This is kind of our big 3. I think we were calling them like opportunity levers, like where or how can we address the workforce shortage? I think kind of begin with the end in mind here for you for just a moment. I think after today, there'll be one more set of edits to final documents. There'll be a slide deck for easy consumption, but also kind of a report summary, not super lengthy, but almost hopefully an executive summary format. Where we'll talk a little bit about the data that we all reviewed, actually quantify some of the challenges that we're facing, not in a super granular level, but enough to tell the story of what we're seeing on the ground in Georgia, and then get into those recommendations. So today we're going to focus on the fix, or the solutions that we all hopefully, again, as Brad said, no silver bullet, no easy fix, but some things that are immediate and then longer term, building the pipeline for the workforce. So maximizing our existing workforce, I think we heard a lot about, and we'll jump into that. Optimizing the education system, and then how we attract new talent into the field. A couple of things that kind of cut across all 3 of those, which we talked a lot about, data and our need for a central set of data fields that can be collected either by an existing agency through an existing mechanism, or some new tool to collect all the data fields, so that I think, Scott, I don't know if it was you said that, so that the next time we're in the same position, we don't have to like go scrambling to figure out how many nurses do we have or how many behavioral specialists do we have, but we've got it already reported. We've got a broad of several recommendations for folks to consider around regulatory updates with the Board of Nursing. And then a couple of occupation-specific recommendations around EMS services and behavioral health, which we'll talk about as well. So we'll try these on and see if we have some alignment. Certainly welcome your feedback today and discussion, but also if we need to follow up offline, we can as well. And we'll see how well these things. So these are kind of highlighted in the same, this slide in particular is highlighted in the same manner in which we reviewed things in Savannah. So we had a whole host of different potential recommendations or opportunities to influence some change. We've still highlighted the ones where there was the most alignment. After our last conversation in Savannah, many of you had a follow-up conversation with our team to revet where do we think we are and are we headed in the right direction. So this is kind of a restatement organization of those conversations that we had and where we found alignment. We're going to switch. This is going to be. So under maximizing our existing workforce, A1 was highlighted at, I think with a lot of alignment around about how we maximize retention and availability of trained professionals by retaining our existing workers in the state, in the profession, and in the workforce more broadly. And we had a lot of conversation around these 2 topics in particular. Number 1, addressing violence in the workplace. So I won't read through all of this. I hope that you have, or that you can see it on screen, but welcome your feedback. We have looked at a number of different pilot programs. We've talked about a number of ways to implement this initiative, addressing violence in the workplace. We've talked about soliciting help from Prosecuting Attorneys Council, whether or not there's a legislative effort that could be picked up around strengthening penalties. happy to hear your thoughts on this one. And then on the second half of the sheet, loan forgiveness for healthcare workers. I think there is some of that is already being addressed and in flight. And I think this is just a further opportunity to echo and amplify those initiatives, but happy to revisit either one of these. Is this where we think we are? Are these kind of the top two things that we all have some agreement on? Thoughts, feedback? This feels like a more formal room than where we were in Savannah, but please just jump in.
Thank you.
Loan forgiveness, just, it's a broad statement, right? The state healthcare, kind of the who, we really wanted to ensure that nursing faculty were specifically called out there. I think right now there is a loan forgiveness for nursing unfunded, but it talks about a bedside nurse versus faculty.
There is one for faculty as well.
Is there?
I think Dr. Sumner talked at our meeting at Mercer about I guess the lack of success for retention long-term when you have those like the Country Doctor Scholarship, different things like that, where people work out their time for the forgiveness and they move on. What I heard more throughout the meetings over and over and over was kind of the begging for funding more nursing faculty positions. It just would seem to me like instead of pouring more money into loan forgiveness, because people have chosen a career in healthcare are probably going to pursue that care because under that path because they have a passion for it. And the question is, how can we get more people in the pipeline? It would just seem to me, from what I heard from a lot of the people that testified or provided information to us, we need to put our money into instruction. It seems like the bottleneck may be whether it's in the college career academies or the technical colleges or the baccalaureate programs or whatever. If we're going to spend money on behalf of the state, we need to figure out how to put that money into instructors.
I think this is a slight of a more from the conversation we had the last time, because I think some of the focus before was related to doing retention bonuses. And we as a group talked about that people would just pay those out. And so we'd sort of get an award of each other. So I do like that we focus more on the loan payback versus both of those things. But again, I don't disagree with your point. It's still some level of confidence that people will stay.
To my knowledge, there's never been a loan forgiveness program in EMS work. It would probably be a little bit more difficult to deal with because now so many of the EMS programs are done by the individual EMS agencies, so that the agency now is picking up the costs for that education. So if we looked at a loan forgiveness, and we would probably either find a way for that individual agency to charge that student, which I think would be a little more complicated than it needed to be, or find a way to help fund those courses that are done by the individual providers, or when the technical college is better to provide more education.
And I do think we need to certainly help the faculty members so that they're incentivized to continue teaching. But I don't want them to be teaching people who are not incentivized to stay in the state. So I don't want to be teaching everybody who are going to move to North Carolina and not be here in Georgia. So I do think maybe in terms of loan forgiveness, maybe something tiered that would make people stay a longer period of time, 3 years, 5 years in where they are, and by tiering off that loan forgiveness so that they grow some roots and hopefully maintain some of those people in the communities that they're already working in.
So I guess I really viewed this one as, so we have, the next slide will be on optimizing the educational system, which you'll see some of this again, but on existing workforce, if in your hospitals currently you had staff that still had student loans, if a new program came about that would say, if you stay with us for 3 or 5 years from today, regardless of where you got your loan, would that make a difference? regardless of fund source, whether it was state funding, we've talked about state hospital partnership funding, some pool of, would that make a difference?
For clarification on the question, would that be if they stayed at that specific facility for that amount of time or within the state? Because you could stay within the state and travel to 3 or 4 different facilities, and it's not really kind of solving that solution. And would it be full-time versus agency?
I would ask y'all, there, I mean, from my standpoint, I can design a program to work any way that we want it to like that. But I would suspect from a hospital perspective, for continuity of care and what you're trying to do with training, that you would want that individual to stay with you, especially if you're putting, if hospitals are putting up their funds to jointly fund some of those things in partnership with the state or fund source, that you would want them to stay. I would suspect you would not want them to be contract or agency staff, and that you would want it to be.
So that if they stay in the community where they have been, they would get more loan forgiveness versus if they moved 50 miles away, 100 miles away to another city, a bigger city, rather than staying in a more rural community too.
Sure.
So what you're proposing is potentially matching funds or partnerships with healthcare systems or healthcare facilities. Is that how I was hearing?
Let me be careful. I'm not proposing, I'm facilitating conversation.
suggesting. I mean, I like that idea.
But I think I have heard from some of you that you feel like that's feasible, right? That it doesn't always have to be 100% state funded, that there are some systems that are doing some things. I know we have some other programs in the works for certain hospital providers that would encourage the reinvestment of certain dollars back into the workforce, where that could be a source of some funding for those programs. So
But there's a lot of things outside the hospitals too, so I don't want us to forget about that. That's
Sure.
number one.
absolutely.
Number two, to me, this slide, what about the existing workforce that's out there right now?
That's what this is about.
Yeah, see, I don't think we're talking about faculty and loan forgiveness, right? Which is all great if you're coming out, if you're in your training, right? But what about the people that have been out there? I'm a little, Dr. Sumner will know this, I've been out there doing it for 24 years. What about those people that have been out there, have sacrificed already? How do we help them? And I would offer regulatory relief, liability relief. There's lots of things. Make it attractive to go to these areas, number one. Number two, your best people are going to recruit are the people already out there. Okay, all the ones that are out there saying, hey, this is a great place to come practice medicine for me. And I think that's the best way to do it. But loan forgiveness works to some degree. It's not the best and it doesn't cover everything, but I think
I would agree.
other things making it attractive to go to these areas and those relief packages, making it so much easier to work out in these areas, I think would be a great benefit.
I think you're spot on. I think loan forgiveness is attractive, like you said, right out, but even that data is.
Yes.
And I think just the loan forgiveness early on, so people know what they're getting into. And, I just want us to remember that unless we increase that pipeline of professionals in all of these professions, then we're still going to be here, a couple of years from now. So it's all about the new people. And I mean, I don't disagree with those that have been out for a while, but we really have to increase the enrollment.
Going to his comment in terms of the existing people, if the assumption is that we're going to increase the workforce, the assumption will be that we need more preceptors, which is one of the issues in some of the organizations. The preceptors are burned out by way of the constant churn. So I bring that up, perhaps the opportunity under this category to address the existing workforce is to give them some level of incentive to train all of these new people that I'm just sure that Georgia's going to add. So that would get you at least some level of thank you for staying, thank you for helping the pipeline, and thank you for, again, your resiliency, and even though we have turnover.
Also, you're talking about people who are contemplating retirement perhaps a little earlier than they normally would have contemplated that too. So there's got to be some incentive. So like Dr. Bulkey, he's out there, he's working how many years, community that's not very large, but how do we incentivize somebody like him? Or, there's
Right.
certainly lots and lots of doctors out there and nurses who, who are contemplating early retirement. How do we keep them focused and keep them in the mix? And it could be preceptorship, it could be teaching, it could be whatever, or just helping them keep people to work with them, maybe somebody who could take over his practice eventually.
So let's move to the next slide and then maybe once we get through the next few, circle back to this one, right? So there's some other things within the education system. And then as we talk about some of the regulatory reforms that y'all have talked about and just in a couple more slides, we'll see if that also addresses some of what I was hearing you say on that.
And I've got one comment for the workplace violence. We can come back to that.
Let's go now.
I was just waiting my turn to get for the others. So with the workplace violence, would it be possible, because I know some of these things will take some time, if we could look at more, and it's just up for discussion, an immediate response as far as if someone attacks a healthcare worker, if the physician decides it is a criminal act versus say a psychiatric act. Because when it happens in our psych hospitals, sometimes your physicians and nurses will agree, this is truly psychiatric. They need treatment and will continue on. But sometimes they feel strongly it's a criminal or behavior act. If it is deemed the case, could we have some discussions with our police officers about removing those individuals from the healthcare setting? Because that is rare. And so then that attacked healthcare worker has to remain and work with that individual. So I don't know if we could have some of those initial conversations. I think there's some confusion because there is a big push. We don't want the mentally ill in jails, but if it's deemed it's a criminal behavior, so there's confusion, I think, around that for some of our police officers.
I like that. It's a great point, and we need to work with our district attorneys in the counties for them to understand what is going on, because that's where, unfortunately, there's, a breakdown once it hits there.
Kelly, could you give I know what you're talking about. Could you give an example for people who might not differentiate as clearly? Because it probably would scare non-medical people.
Sometimes we may have an individual who comes in, have a history of psychosis, has been offered their medication, and then they be very agitated because of that. And say they think a healthcare worker is trying to hurt them in some way, and they may lash out. You can get them on medications and they do a complete turnaround. And we know that. I mean, part of what we do, it's certainly not violent all the time. I don't want to act like it is, but part of what we do, we know that. But then sometimes you have individuals come in who try to work the system, who just have a lack of respect for healthcare workers and will just be violent against them for no intended reason, or will, destroy property. So there is a difference. And I would think if it comes, say, for example, the physician distinguishes that difference, if we could have maybe a different outlook on that, or some discussions about that.
Sure. So let's talk about the education system for a moment. I think we all agreed that more student seats are necessary, but in order to get there, we need more faculty, which I think is the real limiting factor right now. More clinical sites, more clinical space, more faculty. Later, we've got some regulatory language, or at least ideas around how to improve some of that will also impact the educational in terms of part-time faculty, part-time clinicians, some of the different topics that we discussed around that. But so what you see up here first is a newer name and idea, but encompasses a lot of what I've heard. So calling it Quick Start for Healthcare. Quick Start is currently an economic development initiative within the technical college system of Georgia. Many of you may be familiar with it, but the state is very, very good at it. And so as we attract new industry, be it manufacturing, or other types of industries into Georgia, the technical college system has curriculum designers and instructors, a whole team of folks that can design a training program to get folks specifically ready to work in that environment in an accelerated fashion by pooling together their resources, community resources and partnerships to then quickly launch an initiative. I mean, I think the example used most often is how the state has invested and built training programs around Kia when Kia first came to the state. And so we've kind of taken that concept and thought about how we could apply it to healthcare. And so we talked about the interest in having dual enrollment programs around the state, which dual enrollment is a funding mechanism and is available to high school students statewide. What does not necessarily exist is the community partnerships and relationships with local technical colleges, high schools, and then a provider, be it a hospital, EMS provider, whomever, to create that real linear pipeline and pathway that needs to exist. I was fortunate enough to tour Phoebe's simulation labs, but those aren't everywhere, right? And we talked about last time the concept of the DEUs, or the dedicated education units, and taking this concept and homing some of that effort with the Quick Start initiative and sending the resources potentially into a community to establish some of those relationships, because it's going to look different in every part of the state. What works in Albany and Phoebe may not work in Northwest Georgia or in Augusta, but having some folks from the state level, from a technical assistance standpoint, that can be deployed out in a quick fashion and say, all right, what's the real challenge here? Taking some of the data that we've all talked about, what's the real challenge here, and how do we do that? And so pause and see kind of your reaction to that. I think one of the things I particularly like about this is that Quick Start is a brand and a process for a lot of folks that is understood and known. It makes sense. It means something. We're going to apply this concept to healthcare now, not just to a new industry we're recruiting to the state, but to an existing industry that needs some help. And it also gives it potentially, assuming, folks wanted to adopt this, and not saying they will, but it also gives it a home for some of this work to continue that already exists. I mean, our jobs will end in December. We'll hand over a report. But then part of it, I think, is identifying some ways for the work to continue. And so a little bit of a different idea, a little bit of different spin that we kind of thought through after taking some of those other pieces. So would love to hear any feedback to that.
I think this is a great opportunity. I don't see a downside to this in the sense that it would actually help to your point, create some of the pipeline and enthusiasm in our younger generations, if I'm understanding this correctly, and bring it forward. And those partnerships, I think, will be crucial. There are a lot of education universities right now that do partner with high schools for internships at their location, but not necessarily in a hospital. I think those partnerships are well needed. I really do like this idea.
I think it's a great idea. And I think that giving a knowledgeable team authority to implement these programs across the state would be huge, but also help tear down some of those regulatory barriers that have been out there since for 100 years and don't make any sense, to allow these young people to start somewhere and then progress through a system if they so choose, so that it stacks on it. So maybe you're a CNA and then you're an LPN and then so that you get those basics and you get to the workforce and get that experience. One site that I think, and I can't speak for them, but I spend a lot of time in my life in long-term care. So far, there's a lot of opportunity to work in long-term care to get those basic entry-level skills, and it's underutilized. Rather than the ER or the ICU or the nursing force. So, and that industry's been willing to train. We just haven't gotten a foothold on that. And so reaching out to some of the nursing homes, that would help.
To your point, that was one of the things I've made a note about. And I don't know how you correct this, but one of the dumb things that happens in long-term care is that nursing homes, post-acute care facilities that have nurse aid training programs, if they have a bad survey, they lose the training program, which then complicates the issue, because then you can't train and then you can't staff, and then so it doesn't make any sense that you would do that. If there's a way to enhance those programs. Because, a lot of facilities have, at least at some point in their history, like our nursing home has a classroom in it already. It's not used right now because of a survey they got 4 years ago or something. And you have to go through some long process to get that back, and that's a great opportunity. The other one is the career academies. I know there's 31. I would add that to this, because it seems to me like you're talking about trying to get people into these areas. A kid is more likely to stay at home if they start that CNA track in 9th or 10th grade, finish an LPN track, partnering at a hospital or a nursing home. By the time they finish 12th grade, they're an LPN and they go to work somewhere. And then, the traditional track for nurses is not to graduate with a BSN or whatever, but it used to be you became an LPN, you went to work in a hospital or nursing home, and you went to school part-time and finished your next step. That may be how Jean did hers. I don't know, but she was a nurse years ago. But she was a nurse first, but that's how it was. But I think if we can, the quick start thing I love, but I think if we can get into partnering with the high schools particularly,
Yep.
and get those kids graduating high school with an LPN certificate or a CNA certificate, if that's what they want to do with their career, that's the path. That needs to be our focus. That's your path, your pipeline. But also, I think those kids will are more likely to stay around in that region they grew up in.
One of those problems is going to be finding instructors to do this. In the EMS world, we know of several who are trying to do the career academy and or the dual enrollment program, but they're running into issues finding an EMS instructor. Through the trauma commission, we've been funding quite a few EMC courses across the state. And one of the things that we get feedback from those that are trying to do it is finding a qualified instructor to do it. So one of the things we have looked at is about in the pilot program several years. COVID kind of created some issues for us, but doing the didactic combined, and if we could run that kind of a process, I think we could maximize our instructors, and somebody at a technical school could be teaching EMS programs at 4 or 5 different high schools with just someone standing in the room to make sure they don't kill each other during the process. I was in high school, I was one of those. So most people probably are not, but that to me would be a great force multiplier, if you would.
I think this is a great idea. It's something, one thing I've been educated on recently is that our technical colleges lose money on almost all their healthcare programs when you look at a per student. And if they don't have enough other students that in others, other degrees, it doesn't balance out. And it really eliminates the incentive that they have to grow their program. So I think something like this would be welcome, both on the technical college side, but also I think hospitals and healthcare would be
Come to the
all
table.
for it and
Yep.
come to the
Yep,
table.
and I think it's flexible enough that it may take different forms, could take on different forms in different regions of the state. I will add, Courtney, I think the technical college system just got some GEARS funding. If I'm remembering correctly, I'm going to look to anyone that members in the audience to start kind of an online university is the wrong word, but an online technical college system platform that allows the same online courses to be taught and received across the technical college system. To double check my details are right about that, but I think there is something in the works where maybe there is one EMS instructor that actually could provide a course for 5 different technical colleges or any student enrolled in any of the technical colleges, which I think is what they're trying to do, is maximize kind of that leverage, that singular professor across the campuses. So we'll follow up on that. And then the other thing I think I'll just mention to your point, college and career academies, while kind of independently run, do have a little bit of guidance that already comes from the technical college system. They have a little bit of a home there too. So I think there could be some synergies with that as well. All right, we'll keep moving with that one. Earn and learn. So I read this one and I don't know that we captured this one correctly. And Sean, I might call on you. I feel like some of this was from you specifically, and I don't know that we actually accurately captured the sentiment, whether or not it was for the faculty member or the student. But would love your feedback on if we missed the mark on this one.
Thank you for asking. So the Earn to Learn is for a student, from a student perspective. It could be from a faculty perspective, but it's really meant for the student that is in a program. So currently, the Board of Nursing does not allow for students to earn money while in clinical rotations, earning clinical hours for their institution.
Okay.
So if a student is working, let's say as a CNA or a patient care tech at a hospital, and they're working 36 hours a week, if there was a way for us to set up where 12 of those hours could be considered clinical hours, as long as they met certain criteria and certain standards to meet learning outcomes, they could still get paid. The facility still has a worker for the day, and the student could still earn clinical hours. I think the challenge to this would be, how would that account in the Board of Nursing annual reports? Because you have to
Right.
be able to account for your faculty. Just ensuring again that clinical outcomes are being achieved and what that would look like. So I do believe there's a space to do this. I did send the Board of Nursing information on this, as well as a case study from, I believe it was an institution in Virginia. And that was on the document, Sean, that I sent you as well. So it also would help with the faculty shortage, because now I don't need as many full-time faculty covering clinical groups, because I have students, and maybe it's students in certain courses only, or after a certain point within their program only. All of those are open for discussion as well.
Okay, so we may need to tweak this one a little bit, but just to see if I got it right.
Mhm.
So like Dr. Summer, back to your point about long-term care, I know that there's a huge shortage of even CNAs and folks in long-term care. If we can get students that have that credential and count that work while they're earning an actual income as part of their clinical requirements, hours to upskill to the next credential, currently not allowed.
Yep.
Okay.
To that point, what about students that are like EMT students, nursing students that have already done 1101, 1102 coursework, and other ones? Can we look at, I guess it'd be a regulatory thing, but where those people could work as a CNA without doing a CNA course, because they've actually gotten,
They're allowed.
they are already
Mhm.
allowed? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So currently, if you have, once you're past a certain point, usually it's your first clinical rotation in a nursing program, and I can only speak for the BSN, I can't speak for the others. You can actually get hired in as a non-licensed care tech. And the facilities hire you in as a standard employee. So it is an option, and that is also initiative if we can kind of encourage schools and facilities to hire nursing students and get nursing students into that type of field. They get a lot of exposure and it helps socialize them to the culture. So upon graduation, they're more inclined to stay because they know kind of what they're getting into, versus if they're a bartender or work at a golf course or, keep kids on the weekends. That it's a little harder for those folks when they get into the profession to understand what the profession actually is when they get in. So
how does that, because I know we had the temporary nurse aid program during COVID for nursing homes at least.
We still do.
Okay,
Mhm.
so could that program be used like for these other things, whether it's a nursing student or EMT, that I guess where they're a temporary nurse aid after they've done their initial coursework in nursing, EMT or whatever, and then they could work as a CNA.
they do.
They-
They do. Mhm.
Currently do.
EMT students.
Oh, I don't know about EMT.
I'm not talking about nursing, I'm talking about broadening that. I realize the nursing does, but I mean, because, I just think there's opportunity there for getting people.
I'd
already
have
have
to
this.
defer to one of y'all on EMTs. I feel like, at least from the layperson, I feel like there might be a little more wiggle room in what a temporary nurse aide, how they can contribute versus an EMT.
Well, there's a lot of regulatory hoops The first was insurance. The vast majority of insurance carriers, you have to be 19 to start off with. CMS won't reimburse unless you are certified. So, and there's a huge risk factor of having somebody, especially in this state. I hope there are no lobbyists here from the trial lawyers. It's just a huge risk to put anybody in that's not 100% sound certified to do any kind of patient care or even be involved in a transport, because you're just setting yourself up.
Thus, we need liability.
Tort.
We may not go there today.
Look at some of the certifications. Some of the and I know in our accreditors and things that we have to jump through. You wonder who thought of that? I mean, who made up that rule? Because it certainly wasn't a practicing physician, and you don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but they come up with all these rules. Do you have to be 19? I mean, they're 20-year-olds that act 12 and they're 12-year-olds that act 19. So are they suitable for this position? Does the rule matter? I mean, LPNs can't take their boards till they're 18. Is there a reason for that? I don't know. 18 is a common number, but
Well, we've done a very good job lobbying on this because at one time, and I'm gonna show my age, it was 23. You had to be 23 to be insured in EMS.
you dropped a
So we've-
couple more.
Chiseled it down to 19. So I'm not sure it's gonna go any lower, but it does cause a problem, especially with the joint projects with high schools where you could pull someone right out when it's a real problem right now. Doing that.
So I was thinking that there was, and I tried pulling up the board rules to see if I could find it, but I thought that there was something that said you had to be 18 before you could test. Because when we're looking at the quick start, that's something to take into consideration because you might be able to go through your high school dual enrolled and do all of this. And if you graduate at 17, you still have to wait before you can get your licensure. So as they're talking about age, EMTs, I mean, that's a great point as well, because there might be a possibility for them maybe working in an emergency room as a patient care tech and getting that exposure in that type of a setting as well.
So can you work as this is maybe my ignorance, but can you work as a CNA if you're not 18 at this point?
I think so.
If your organization allows people younger than 18, I mean, there are a lot of varying limitations, I think, depending on the board, depending on the education system, depending on the organization.
So could those people that you're talking about, they're able to work, can they go straight to take the CNA test?
My understanding is in high schools right now, you can graduate with a CNA.
That's right.
I'm talking
And have
nursing
your,
students, can you do that now?
yeah, nursing students after their first clinical can work as a CNA. They don't have to test.
They don't have to
Mhm.
test, okay.
And the question that you're asking in terms of the pipeline, perhaps the other opportunity for pipeline is there some other direct patient care opportunities, for an example, that we don't talk a lot about, but sitters. So in the current, because we don't have enough sitters for patient safety, we pull CRNAs to do sitting work. So perhaps we take one step back for that pipeline and give them the opportunity, again, to get in the hospitals, get exposed. Do the work. I was gonna also just say, I like the earn and learn because it also addresses a little bit of the hesitancy in terms of the discussion between healthcare entities and the academic side. And that is, for every person you take out of my walls is one person that I could have been using to take care of patients. But in this model, if you keep them in the walls, you give me the opportunity to take more students. You let me open a DEU unit. You incentivize my staff to precept, and I'm connecting all these three. I think all of these that you prioritize fit together with the storyboard that we're trying to get to.
That's right. That's right.
I really support that and apologize for my voice, but I think the DEU unit is a really important partner with this because we have to look at our accreditation standards in addition her nursing programs to what the State Board of Nursing rules and regulations are. And so by having instructors as part or adjunct faculty as part of the DEUs, that helps us overcome that barrier and does provide additional faculty. So I like that if whatever, there can be new nomenclature for DEUs, and they certainly don't have to only exist within acute care settings, but other types of settings as well. So I think that partnership.
Good. Let's move on. And I think we'll end up coming back to some of these, but so for attracting new workers, these were the two that I think we heard the most about. And so want to check to see if this is where we still feel like the biggest kind of opportunity to move the needle is. One, and some of them overlap, right? But using dual enrollment, we certainly talked about, but how we market that to students and make sure that they're aware of those opportunities. And then two, again, looking at additional scholarship opportunities for healthcare education programs, not necessarily loan forgiveness. I think one of the things we talked about, I heard in Savannah, especially when we're talking about CNAs and moving on from there. If a student completes coursework and gets licensed as a CNA, should there be some opportunity for a scholarship or grant to move on in their education, even if they weren't a 3.0 student, if they now have a credential and are eligible to work in the field? And so it shifts from a merit-based focus on how well you performed in that coursework to, can you work in the workforce and do we need you? And so certainly those would require some new thought from the state side, but want to kind of test those two ideas with y'all. If that's still where we think there's some opportunity.
I had one question in reference to the dual enrollment, and this is just, again, maybe my not understanding some of the program that is currently in place. Would this be for all institutions within the state or just university system programs?
Currently, dual enrollment is eligible to Hope eligible institutions.
Okay. Is there a way that we can look at all STEM programs or healthcare programs regardless of Hope eligibility? That's a selfish question.
Yes, we probably need to talk. I think that
Okay.
becomes a challenge for this group to recommend
Understand.
because it's hard to narrow that down and not bleed into other critical shortage fields.
Yep, understand. Okay, understand. Mhm.
Other than that, I think it's great.
No, it's needed. If you incentivize people, again, one of the main reasons that students either don't pursue or don't finish a program is finance. They're working 40 hours and trying to do this. A lot of students. Some do have a good foundation and are able to make it through school. Some are not. So if there's a way where we can help those students, I think that's needed.
The state did start piloting, and we were just trying to finish up our research over the last few days on completion grants. And so we
Mhm.
piloted those during COVID with emergency education funding, modeled after what Georgia State really does really well in Panther grants. And so expanded those throughout the university system to students that were in the second half of their educational career and really had small dollar balances that needed to get across the finish line. And so something we've talked about, whether or not that's in flight, but whether or not we need to prioritize some of those funds, or at least this group recommend prioritizing those funds for students that are in healthcare that we know we need to get. So it's not on this page, but it's something that we've talked about as we're kind of running down how that's been implemented right now.
I would offer too, you need to maximize your technology. When we talk about your EMS having one instructor able to do it virtually, right? I can imagine it's a little bit easier now to work the 40 hours and have online nursing and some of that. So we have to do that, back in the 70s and 80s when they were working and having to go to class physically. I think it should be offered, in different times to be flexible in doing those kind of things. And I think it should be a little bit easier in that regard. And I would offer that we really need to get to the high schools. That's where it all starts, right? Your sophomore and junior year in high school, you've got to get out, not just hand them a flyer, or whatever, send something home to the parents. You need to get out there and somehow have a roving roadshow, whatever you want to call it, and get out in front of these students.
I agree. And I think for me, that's where some of the Quick Start or TCSG or whatever you want to call it, folks building those pathways within the community and making it easy for students to navigate and to see the pathway very clearly, to know that the partnership with the hospital has been established. Here's where this takes you. Here's what it looks like, so that every student's not trying to like reinvent the wheel on their own.
Correct.
All right, let's look at, we had two at the beginning that really kind of cut across a number of the different categories or areas of improvement. And the first one was we're calling it healthcare infrastructure, not necessarily in the capital sense, but just the underlying infrastructure for the system, but to support a centralized data clearinghouse. And so we'll ask a couple of y'all to kind of review and chime in on this one on whether or not we need to get more specific. And we certainly have some case studies and some examples, but is there even ideas around the tools that already exist? We certainly heard from the Healthcare Workforce Board and what they're collecting and reporting on. Certainly it doesn't encompass everyone that's represented on this commission or all the different healthcare fields, but specific ones. But is there a different tool that's already being used? Is there interest in some new tool, or maximizing or leveraging a tool that already exists so that we can capture the data? What data do we really feel like is most important?
Well, then the EMS will always generally report out how many EMS people are licensed. And that's an interesting number. Means nothing to me because I don't know how many of them in the back of ambulances. And I can assure you, there's probably a lot of nurses out there who are home right now because that's where they're going to be. And the number of people actually working, what I would like to see is a number of people who actually are on ambulances transporting patients. Because you look at some of the large fire services, all of their medics, all of their people are medics, usually at the EMT level. And that's great. It's a wonderful thing, but they're not in the back of ambulances. And when you look at whether you can transport patients, those folks don't count. The ones who count are the ones who are actually riding in the back of an ambulance taking care of folks. So I would like to, maybe that's more granular than folks want to be, but every time we make a trip, we fill out a trip report, put our license number on it, so the data is there. I don't know why it can't be reported.
And this is about where, like, the zip code, not where they live, but the zip code of where they work. Because sometimes those are different, and that will make a difference in your rural areas. I might live here but work there, and that will impact your numbers. I believe that the NCSBN for the Board of Nursing, I believe that they have required data that they have to collect, but the Healthcare Board is aware of what that is as well. I believe they're in conversation with some nurse leaders on that.
So is this about the right level of specificity for this recommendation? Just that we think there needs to be more work around data?
I'll give you an example on a little further on Courtney's point. We know there are around 24,000 certified EMS personnel in Georgia. Of that, 14,000, we estimate the stick count are on the back of an ambulance. Of that, 2,000 have multiple jobs. So how do you count them? They work 2 jobs in EMS. So when you come down to it, you really only have 11,500 folks in the state of Georgia that are really doing EMS. They're not working in a dock in a box. They're not at a jail or whatever else, a hyperbaric chamber. Who knows? There's so many different roles that EMS people are doing today with their certification that. And to bring Courtney's point, it's very important that we have an accurate count as to really what's our pool of folks in the back of an ambulance that are actually there rendering care when someone dials 911. Never mind the interfacility, which is very important, or the non-acute type calls, but the real essential 911.
In the hospital world, they call it surge. And public health has done a lot of work for the last decade or so about surge. And how can the hospital surge up for that mass incident, COVID or whatever? So in EMS, we're considered fully staffed if we can man every truck. But in rural Georgia, there's quite a few communities in rural Georgia today. A one-car accident is a disaster. Because if you got 3 people in that car and you got 1 ambulance on duty, it becomes a problem. Unless you can roll it on the hood and transport them that way. And nobody knows that information. Nobody knows how many crews are staffed. One of the hospitals I've been talking to, and they've actually got a conference call next week with the technical school and some other folks trying to set up a dual enrollment program. But that community has 2 ambulance crews, A crew, B crew. They're not on the same day. A crew works today, B crew works tomorrow, A crew works the next day, B crew is on 24, off 24. And that's what their staffing pattern is because they can't find people. So we need to understand that and try to find ways to help deal with that because those guys are not going to do that forever. They'll burn out, they'll go home and then they won't have any.
I think that's really true with all healthcare. You know, who's working what, I mean, I think 33,000 licensed doctors in Georgia and about 19,000 practice, and some of them don't practice much. And you don't really know what they do. They may trained as a internist, but they do weight loss, you know. So, but when you talk to doctors about not filling out their form for licensure, which you're required to do, a lot of people don't, they give them minimum information. A lot of times they say, well, you hate to put your information out there. You hate to put it for public, you know, perhaps if we had a census of healthcare in a sense, where you could put it into a private database and ask that every practicing physician in Georgia and nurse in Georgia to fill that out once and just get a baseline and not let it be publicly available for a period of time till we analyze it and see what the needs are. Everybody's afraid of identity theft and things like that. They just don't want to they put out what they have to, and that's the least.
I mentioned this last week, and I know this is a fine line in terms of how we compete with each other, but compensation, having some level of standard commitment to what level of information you'll fill out in market assessments. There'll always be, you know, different bonus structures and, you know, PRN, sort of reactive things according to what's happening. But if we could get sort of a basic level, we all give that same information, I think it would create some level of that we're not so much competing with ourselves for just the dollars, but the culture and the environment and the community that people want to work in.
You know, we have the survey, the hospital survey, and I'm not sure if EMS has a similar tool that's required every year or long-term care facilities or other than. I think it just would take a tweak to those, you know, what data it you know, will be impactful as we think about the state of workforce and you know, across our state, you know, on an annual basis, that we really get, you know, are our tactics working? And if we just put all this into place, but we haven't benchmarked where we're at today, and we can't do it in a year or two, how will we know if this is working? We'll go on a gut feel. And so to me, those tools are in place, and we should leverage them. We should maximize the leverage in them.
Good. All right, let's talk about the board of nursing. It's probably one of the areas where we had the most conversation about potential tweaks or changes to regulatory language. And so I think we're still working to figure out, should we get, I think we've got hopefully we have most of the concepts accurately depicted, but whether or not we want to get even more granular with draft language, and I would need to enlist some help here on, we're talking about on the way over, if this commission wants to suggest language, or is this enough? So we've got the issue around allowing part-time faculty to be counted in required student to instructor ratios, which we think, if I remember correctly, should free up that ability to leverage that a little bit more. Changing the ratio of permitted part-time teaching faculty allowed in didactic settings. I think that was one of the constraints. And then considering an alternative discipline system for reports against nurses. I think we heard a little bit about whether or not the discipline system for nurses where infractions are brought against them or their infractions that they're, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth or suggest this, but if we're removing or suspending licensure too quickly, or if there's a corrective action plan that should be considered that doesn't currently exist, and I would love feedback on that.
On the changing of the ratio for part-time and a didactic, can we add clinical to that as well? I know from my perspective, it was more the clinical component, and if we can be open with the definition of part-time, does that include adjunct? Does that include visiting professors or whatever terminology the institution provides that person that is contract versus hired informally as a part-time instructor?
And does this category also include the discussions we had about the advanced practitioners? I think there's a lot of question in terms of how we utilize them, how they're trained, how flexible they can be, especially when we're talking about the consensus model. The example would be many of our nurses who go back to get an advanced degree, they came from critical care. But in the current consensus model assumptions, you cannot count that as them being competent when they graduate to go back and work in that setting. They have to take extra courses, which thus costs the organizations more money. Even in right now in the current cohort, there's some organizations that have, 100+ people that perhaps would have to go back to school to meet the requirement of this new consensus model that's coming up.
Is that where, like, you talking about where family nurse practitioners can't work in the inpatient setting?
Yes, and for an example, in COVID, some of the organizations developed, for example, bridge programs that the ICU nurses needed so much help, and we had APPs that perhaps they went back to in working in critical care, but they didn't take a full patient load. They became the experts. And so the consensus model, if completely implemented, may throw some wrenches in that construction.
If I can add one more thing for consideration, please.
Of course.
Currently, the Board of Nursing does not allow BSN students who are unsuccessful in the program for whatever reason to test for their LPN licensure. Florida does, as an example. So let's say a BSN student, for whatever reason, they're unsuccessful in a nursing program, but they're 90% complete with their program. Some institutions state that once you're academically dismissed, you cannot come back to school. So they're done. A lot of schools won't then take a student that's been dismissed from one school into their school because it's at risk for not passing your NCLEX pass rate. There's a whole culture to that, right? But if we allow those BSN students to test for their LPN, they've met all of the LPN requirements as long as they're within a certain percentage of their BSN program. And then you have now an LPN licensed nurse, and schools might look more favorably about bringing in a nurse who's been practicing past their LPN boards back into maybe an LPN bridge program or an ASN program or even a BSN program. So I would like to add that proposal as well.
I'd like to go back to the didactic and recommend almost a silence on that from the Board of Nursing and leave that to the educational institution for ratios, because the clinical makes a difference in those faculty to student ratios and some flexibility, again, not to only focus on DEUs, but just how that's being explored. But the didactic, each accredited higher education institution already has some of those measures in place, and I think that would be something to look at too.
So say that one more time.
So that the comment is in terms of faculty to student ratio, that it's solely focused on the clinical component,
You think it should only be focused on
the
clinical? Okay.
clinical learning and environment.
But aren't there requirements for the classroom as well that are limiting enrollment in some programs?
It's a
throughout the
1 to
state?
25 faculty and they just changed it. It was 1 to 20 faculty to student ratio. It's now 1 to 25. It doesn't mean you have to have 1 faculty to 25 students in the classroom, but it does mean you have to have 1 faculty to 25 enrolled in the whole program. So, you know, with that said, it does absolutely limit how many students you can enroll. And if you are not meeting that requirement, you have to file a waiver with the Board of Nursing. And right now within the state, most institutions are not meeting that requirement. Well, I shouldn't say most, a lot are not meeting that requirement. And they did just increase it to try to
So
help.
it's both then, it's classroom and clinical.
The 1 to
faculty.
25 is didactic.
Yes, yes.
Mhm. But if they're in didactic, or if they're in clinical, they're in didactic. So it really doesn't help a lot.
And I'm sorry, but do you think we should be silent on the didactic?
Mhm.
Okay.
And that, and saying that, you know, whether the institution is SACS accredited, which most would be, or other levels of accreditation, take care of that overall faculty to student ratio. And that where the oversight or that regulatory component, it's more important is in that clinical setting. So in other words, if you're teaching a pathophysiology class, that ratio is not as relevant, and each institution would already be mitigating that in some way, whatever that is. So kind of comes down to that overall, not commenting then on the overall ratio, but rather just the clinical ratio.
I have to say, I think it's both. I understand that, you know, to get the clinical experience, that's where some of the limitations are. But in the classroom, if we really want to expand enrollment, then it seems we have to address both sides of that equation somewhere. So I get it. The regulatory agency of the institution really does have the final say, but we don't want any limitations to come out of the Georgia board for that. And that's where that part-time faculty comes in my experience, that it's that classroom faculty that I've been told by educators have to be a certain number of full-time, which really limits the student enrollment, because there are faculty that are part-time. So I think it just has to hit both.
It gets on the pipeline again. I think if we're limited on the number of instructors that we have and limited on the amount of capital space we have, really the only way to increase the pipeline, if we've got students who, I think the other thing I heard from somebody that provided information to us was there's still a lot of nursing students or candidates that are on waiting lists, I guess, that have applied that can't get in. So I think the intent on making a recommendation to look at increasing that ratio was to allow more acceptances into the current buildings with the current faculty as a way to relieve that pressure. But
And adding the repository to that as well, because student X may not get into University X. But if we can add that to the data component of that, where we partner with the Board of Nursing, because, you know, one university may not have space, but 5 others might. And then that way the student has an opportunity. And you could do that across healthcare degrees as well, or certifications. So that might be something for EMTs too, where here's an institution that can take additional students. I mean, that can be used across everywhere. If I can add one more thing, I'm sorry, to the LPN component of that. You have a lot of trained medics in the military that have gone through LPN type training. I would like to propose if there's a way where we can look at allowing them to sit for their LPN as well. after they've reached a certain designation within the military. Because they go through the same training.
So could they just take those in?
Yeah.
I
could
think
they just
that's
like
what I
this?
was getting at with the nursing homes specifically. Nursing homes only get paid for certified nurse aides. So they have to be certified. So even though they're allowed to work, nursing home can't put that on a cost report, unlike the hospital. So what I was proposing is allowing those nursing students, if you will, after that first course, or encouraging them to all just sit for the CNA exam at that point and do the skills check off, because we're already doing it. And then they could work in a nursing home and be applied to a cost report, because that's the issue, is only certified CNAs can be, they really can't employ somebody that's not certified. But if we could use those students, I think there's probably a lot of people that could work.
There is some precedent to what you're talking about with the military. We did that with EMS a few years ago, the advanced tactical medic. They took registry boards when they went through school, and then they ended up being stationed in Somalia. And it's hard to get your seat and get your continuing aid units there, so they lost the registry. Came back with all their skill sets, so we allowed them in Georgia to come back. In Georgia, so most of them were being rotated back to Fort Benning. And then they would take the Georgia boards, and they could use the Georgia boards for reciprocity. They ended up keeping a bunch of them. So I mean, they're great folks.
Mhm.
Let's move to, we had two kind of areas of focus with both EMS and the behavioral health. Some of them are things we've talked about, and they're just repetitive and amplify and echo what we've highlighted on some of the other slides. But I think we felt like from everything that we heard, that it was really important to call out these two specific professions that need a little bit or a lot of attention in terms of our recommendations. And so I think what you'll see here hopefully echoes, and Courtney, I'll look to you.
So I like what you're saying there, and I think the biggest thing is that we're either gonna have to put money into allowing the local services to have enough funding to teach their own classes, or we have to re-engage the technical colleges. When I came along, they did it all. Of course, when I came along, there was a ton of federal money that was involved. So I think I paid $10 to take them, and that was just to pay the malpractice insurance. It was free. I think we're gonna have to work on the pass rates, because in rural Georgia, I don't know, that's my perception, that if you have a school that you have a thing in rural Georgia where 10 or 15 kids take the class and 2 of them pass, well, it lights Facebook up. So the next class, nobody wants to take it. So we've got to figure out a way to figure out why that's happening and ensure that, I have some folks say it's bad instruction, some folks say it's bad students. You can blame it everywhere, but we don't have any kind of data to look at why this is occurring.
Sure.
So that's the frustration level. And I know that's not something that this board needs to get involved in. I don't think anyway, but at the end of the day, EMS is never going to be successful as long as we pay what we do. One of the groups I was talking to, the one that has an A crew and a B crew, he thought he got a paramedic because he's a director. He has to work the shifts too. And paramedic didn't show up to work. He called him, said, why didn't you show up to work? He said, I had a job running a forklift, making twice what you would pay me. So he's a forklift operator instead of a paramedic. So and a lot of them go on to nursing, which I think is great. I know a lot of my colleagues think that's a terrible thing. We don't need for them to leave. I like to see somebody start at a level and work their way up to get as much education, to be as much value to their community as it can be. So I think it's a great progression. I like the idea of starting at EMT and going on to paramedic, the nurse bridge program, and some of the better folks I've seen through that process. So,
How long is the training?
to be a paramedic, you're gonna spend more time in class and clinical to be a paramedic than a 2-year RN. If you're looking at, well, they've just created a new licensure called EMT responder. That's about, what, Pete, about 6 months.
Give or take.
Yeah. So if you want a progression of EMS, and the bad part about the progression is as you progress through, you burn your hope grant up. And by the time you go to paramedic school, it's all on you. So you can start off at EMTR, which is fairly short, and then EMT, and then advanced EMT, and then paramedic. So, and we've changed the names over the years of the different licensure levels, which is a little frustrating also.
Can I ask you one question? One thing that's interesting is it seems like there's a transition from the training from our technical colleges to local services. Is that most, I mean, why do we think that is? Like, why are we not able to educate them through the technical colleges? Is it just the
It comes back to that comment. How much money does it cost to educate them?
Yeah.
And if you're, the last one, the technical college did in our community was about 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. They had 6 students. It's hard to get an instructor and pay them to come and teach a class for 6 students. When we advertise it and we have done with the Trauma Commission grant money, we'll have like 25 to sign up. Doesn't cost them anything because the grant money pays for it. And then usually we will lose about half of those. Those get in the game. I kind of get that. We do interview them to make sure that we make them write an essay. That's what to do or not, but it's interesting to read. You can at least pick out the ones who can't write a coherent paragraph and tell them to stay home.
Is this another opportunity where that technology online track makes a lot of sense where our technical colleges could lead the way of having, I guess, more regional instruction or a centralized instruction? We have one instructor who may be able to do the didactics for a bunch of people.
Well, I think like everything else, times change and you have to look outside the box. And what might have been the solution with the technical school pre-COVID 5 years ago, 10 years ago, now has evolved as a need. And there are more outlets, there are more opportunities for school. And you have to understand that when you're looking for an EMTR, you're competing against Amazon.
Yeah.
Who knows who you're competing against to get that student, that 19, 20, 21-year-old in the door. At our academy, we're fortunate enough to be able to pay $17.50 an hour while you're sitting in class learning to become an EMTR. And that's what it takes right now, at least in the Metro Atlanta area, to recruit someone, retain them, and have them finish the EMTR program. We also offer the EMTB, the EMTA, the paramedic, the expanded scope, the critical care paramedic. It's all free as long as you remain a 2-year commitment to Metro Atlanta, to our company. So that's the new mode of education in at least the Metro Atlanta area and in certain urban pockets within Georgia, where the EMS company, public or private, is funding, not the VOTEC, the entire education for those students. And it's probably worth $30,000-$40,000 of schooling that if you make a 2-year commitment, it's no charge.
So then it'd be hard for the technical colleges, it seemed, to compete with the private programs if you can earn money while you're going to school versus, it seems, I mean, it just seems like we've kind of shifted to a point.
Well, it
where
has.
Like a point of no return.
It has shifted. And remember, we're not funded by hope. So, we also pay taxes, unlike the rest. So it's a very, very difficult dynamics that has occurred, a shift, for not a better word, but it's just a market necessity that due to the fact that there's scarcity of candidates, you know, we're doing what we can to recruit, retain, and promote from within. I think, Courtney, you were part of that. There's a great Senate study in EMS from the mid-2000s that identified that there was going to be a crisis in EMS. It was just a matter of time or something. Well, that something that escalated, of course, was COVID. And as Courtney mentioned, we basically burnt our people out. That's what it boils down to. And our medics make on average in the low 70s for a 42-hour work week. And the Atlanta market was such that you could find something that paid 90 or in the 80s for the same amount of time. Just a different environment or a controlled environment, like a penitentiary for example. So there was a mass exodus. And again, you know, as having an academy, I have nothing against folks bettering themselves, wanting to become a nurse, wanting to become a PA, become a physician. I'm happy to say we've had 9 that have worked at Metro Atlanta that have become physicians. It's great. I have no issue with that. It's just the way that this has fallen post-COVID. It has just taken its toll. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I have an academy that was started way before COVID, kind of saw the handwriting on the wall and took some action on it. But it's a very challenging time for EMS. My hand goes out to Courtney in the rural environment. We at least have candidates and population to recruit from, and they do not. So it's a real crisis in the rural market.
Several medical schools around the country, and Greenville, I think, was the first one that required all their entering freshmen to be EMTs. And it was not to be the EMT, it was to see and to understand the social determinants, the health disparities, to go in the home, because these kids never go in some of these homes. And we were going to do that as well. But accreditors require you to have the same exact experience. And we had a couple of young people who graduated who were in wheelchairs. They couldn't get in them. And so we backed off and we have EMRs now that emergency medical responders, but there's a basic EMTR.
Well, the EMTR came, as we call it, an EMT-RS. They came out of an ask that we did during the COVID crisis. There was such a shortage between the people calling out, the people that were going elsewhere, that we had a very tough time with headcount. And it was not just us, it's fire also. So we asked state, and very thankful to your department, to help create this level that exists in other states. In fact, I think it's 40 of the 50 had it. Georgia was not one of them. So it enabled us to put folks on street with less training. And again, these folks do nothing but low acuity and they just drive. Technically, that's all they do.
Well, that's not exactly true in every.
Not in every market.
State. It is true with Pete's company, but depending on what arena you see, the medic in the back of that 911 truck may be an EMTR.
With all those different levels, what age do you have to be? Can you just
19.
quickly go to be a paramedic or to take any of the
If
exams?
there was a way, I'm just going to throw the number 19.
Okay,
That's what the insurance.
so you can't take any of
drive it.
the exams, or well, you could.
You
but-
could take them
Okay.
all, you could study
you
for
can't
all of
work.
them, but you can't work. And we have had students, I won't mention the private school, but we've had several that have gone through the whole thing.
Yeah.
And they just want to have that for their resume. So when they apply to med school, they have all this. So, but they can't work in the back of an ambulance.
So one thing I will point out, what Pete pays people to be in school is greater than the average paramedic pay in Rural Georgia. Source per hour. Now, those guys in the community I talked about a while ago are knocking out a whole bunch of money because they're making like a huge amount of overtime. So, but they're burning them out. The other, and there's kind of a positive nature to it. when we were doing our own EMTs classes, we were using instructors. The last one, he worked a full-time job, and a full-time EMS job and a part-time EMS job, and he taught for us. All right, so how much time did he have to put into it? About what we got out of it, to tell you the truth. So it facilitated us, before I left, to put money in the budget to hire an instructor. So now we've got a full-time instructor for our community, for our EMS. That's a positive thing because he can help maintain the competencies of our medics. But it was an additional pretty big chunk of change for us on our budget.
I would offer if you're driving as an EMS in Atlanta, you're pretty good, right? I mean, that's pretty good. To be able to drive around here.
For those of us from South Georgia, we'll pay them $17 to get us out of town.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's jump to behavioral health. So we've got kind of a high level on how healthcare stakeholders could support more on the job practical training for behavioral health support positions, expand role of behavioral health support positions, streamline credentialing for qualified providers who want to practice in both in Georgia and in other states. And I think that may bleed into the last one of maintain flexibility in Georgia's telehealth regulations to make current evidence-based practices permanent. Some of the flexibilities that were implemented during COVID, I think that's the recommendation. So Sally, I might call on you for initial feedback on this one.
Yeah, I think it looks good. These recommendations would be very helpful. And then expand the role of behavioral health support positions is that the med tech I talked about last meeting. That would not cost the state any money, but would be a huge help to our operations and being able to have our nurses focus more on nursing services and take that task off of them. So that could make a huge difference just in that one bullet point without costing money. Here to help.
The only thing that I don't see, but I know just enough about it to be dangerous. Listening to my emergency department team. On the regulatory side, or perhaps it's not regulatory, perhaps it's just process, is the hoops that you jump through for getting a patient placed. So I don't know. Again, I know just enough about it to be dangerous, but it seems to be a theme that the patients could potentially stay in the emergency departments at very different times. I don't know.
There are quite a few factors that go into
Yeah.
that, multiple
Is that like a can
areas.
of worms?
That's a little can of worms. If this group can solve it, then we can save more time, but I don't know if we
I told you I
can.
know just enough about it to be dangerous.
I think the workforce plays into that. And the sheer fact that there's not enough placement options. And certainly we have worked with Sally and others and continue to have conversations on how we improve that. I think we'll continue to. There'll be a whole body of work just on probably that alone in the coming months, but I don't know that we'll be able to get at that directly.
Yeah. Okay.
So it is nearly 2:30. There are 45 other slides that you guys got. We are not going to go through all of those, but they're very more granular on a little more specificity on some of the specific programs or ideas that align with each of the things that we saw on one of the very early slides on all the different ways that we can either maximize our existing workforce, optimize the educational input or system, or attract new workers. And all of these additional slides kind of back up those specific ideas that continue to support those. If there is anything, and several case studies in here as well of things that we heard about programs from other states or that y'all mentioned in places that we've chosen to include as here as potential case studies for folks that want to look at some of that. So was there anything else in here that y'all really wanted to highlight or take like this one? I think we've talked a little bit that connecting Georgia employers and upcoming graduates to promote opportunities in the state. I mean, that's just one of the things we've heard. Again, 45 slides we won't recover today. Is there anything in the first set of 15 slides that, other than what we've already commented on, is just a glaring omission on your part or something that you feel like we shouldn't include, either side of that coin.
I mean, there's one thing I want to include. I don't know where it fits, and I've talked about this multiple times, but I think I know it's a nuclear bomb to talk about caps on salaries and stuff like that, but the one thing that I keep looking at, and I've read a bunch about it, is, and I know like from practicing on the ground, I still feel like we can throw people in the pipeline all we want, but as a state, if we don't address and at least have some oversight for agencies, it's going to be an issue for us because agencies continue to siphon off staff from nursing homes, hospitals, whatever. It makes it difficult to fund those positions because they're siphoning off the staff and they turn around and rent them back to you for double what you were paying before. I think anybody in acute or post-acute care is feeling that pressure. But what I was going to propose is a recommendation that a work group be formed because 15 states have already either passed or have legislation in progress to address agencies. And most of them are not caps on salaries, but for instance, protecting the employees. These are 1099 employees. Okay, yet the agencies are charging facilities overtime pay for them. But there's actually a case in Pennsylvania that I shared that where an agency withheld like almost $5 million from their employees. They charge the facilities for overtime pay, et cetera, and that money doesn't make it to the staff. But things like just some oversight where if I'm hiring somebody from an agency, I know I know how many hours that person's worked this week. I know that they've had some sort of skills check off to say that they're qualified to work in the unit that I'm in. And right now there's just none of that. So I think a work group to look at how, and because it's not going to go away. This is going to be the new norm for staffing, I'm afraid. But things to protect the facilities where agencies can't send people in to recruit on healthcare campuses, for instance, at a hospital. I just think there's some work that could be done to protect both the employees and the healthcare system, but allow that partnership, which is pretty vital. But
I don't know that it's nuclear, but I think that's a slippery slope. I think how we have viewed some of these things, and maybe there's still an opportunity to get at that without what it is. I think the staff have viewed some of this document as, here are some things that we can do immediately or the state can look at. But some of these recommendations are for providers and hospitals to pick up and consider what best practices are and whether or not that's within existing groups and organizations where that work and conversation continue, maybe what that looks like more so than state oversight. Because I think that is probably a slippery slope. But I think that would love to hear other feedback on how to phrase that in a way that I am mindful of reports coming out like this I think why we have chosen the 3 big and 6 or 7 or 8 that we have is because that's where we had the most alignment when we spoke to each of you. And I'm a smidge fearful that if we put every single idea that we hear up there, we end up with nothing moving. Whereas if we put all our weight behind the few that make the most difference, that we may find some traction in some of those things getting interest as opposed to just sitting on a shelf somewhere. And so I'm a little mindful of that balance, but certainly want to be responsive and respectful of what the entire commission, how we issue that final report and what that looks like. And if that's a kind of ending recommendation that there are several other areas where existing association or provider groups can band together and create some best practices or have some discussion. And maybe that's one of the things that's in there on how and when providers are using agency contract staffing and self-regulate some of those things. Are there some other things that we should put in kind of a closing recommendation on what other work groups should continue?
To your point, I hate to, I absolutely couldn't agree with you more. And I'd love to see the commission at the end say there's a huge physician crisis out there in the state of Georgia, right? We didn't really touch a lot on that, which I agree, the nursing and everything takes precedence right now. But I think I'd love to see the commission say that more work needs to be done because there's pediatricians are lacking, there's OBGYNs are lacking, general surgeons, boy, they're not training general surgeons. And if you have an urgent appendix that needs to be taken out and you're out in the middle of a hospital that doesn't have it, that's going to be an issue, and certainly in primary care. So you don't have enough time to do this here, and this is the last meeting, I understand that, but to your point, what you just said, I think that should be working forward, moving on in this regard. That we should encourage that we continue to look at solving that issue moving forward. So thanks.
In reference to the agency, I think I like how you phrased it. It is something that I think if we can manage pipeline and manage some of the other areas that we've discussed, that will naturally and organically resolve some of the agency issues. To where maybe we wouldn't have to have legislation standing behind it, because there would be an intention and purpose and strategy to keeping folks in the profession at their location or joining the profession. So my hope is that organically it will resolve some of that. It might just take a little longer than we would like.
Well, the good news is that there was a recent report that came out that said that Georgia was in the top 10 of reducing the agency rates based upon the processes that we put in place in our organizations. So going back to what you said, I think that we haven't solved it, but there are some creative things happening within the spaces. I believe that perhaps this is one of the examples that could give us the opportunity to collaborate with each other. Because when we talk to team members who took on the agency assignments, the money was surely very enticing, but also they just wanted a different setting. In the setting that they were in, the acuity may have been higher, the call schedule may have been pressing. And so I don't know, this is way out in left field, but if one system would partner with 5 rule settings to say, I'll trade you. I'll let, people be flexible and assign agency. I think there's opportunity to collaborate better in that space. Because we're not going to solve it individually for each organization.
I would love to see a work group to really establish what those best practices are. So that all the things that we're hopefully going to put in place will work, some short-term, some long-term. But I do think Mary's right. There's a lot that an organization can do individually and maybe collectively to put things in place that can prevent the agency issues that we currently have today.
Thank you. One last comment. You asked us before about the Board of Nursing. You had mentioned perhaps we should have a group that would work with the Board of Nursing. Did we decide no? Or I think there was conversation at the last meeting because all of these things touch so closely to the Board of Nursing, that how do we stay connected to what we're wanting, requesting they consider? I don't know, but.
I got it. I had a couple questions on the slides that we have. On slide 32, under the C10B, establishing a state incentive for programs that can increase available faculty and capacity. I do think we had a pretty strong, consistent message that we don't need more programs. We just need to be able to support the programs that we have as far as BSN pre-licensure. There might be opportunity for BSN Bridge, or I'm sorry, for LPN to RN bridge. I do think that's a big area of opportunity for nursing specifically. Under the opportunity section for this slide, under B, it says encourage increased faculty recruiting volume from state institutions to prompt growth of these programs for prioritizing universities that can expand programs. So like, I have a capacity to expand. This is what we're going to do. Is there a way where we can actually look at outside maybe of this committee, how we can increase the faculty pool? Because otherwise it's just going to end up being almost like agency nursing. We're just going to keep pilfering from each other, and it's going to be a revolving door between organizations and institutions.
Fully support those comments and that it's not more programs, but more incentives for faculty. And was going to mention that I really didn't see that as a sub bullet somewhere. I may have missed it when I reviewed prior to the meeting, but that incentivizing, on the front end for individuals who are already registered nurses to pursue that graduate education to be able to fill some of our faculty vacancies. Again, that's one of those, if we don't solve that.
Yep.
We're in this same conversation 2 years, 5 years from now.
So funding the faculty, I mean, you're getting back to funding the faculty, but I guess what he was saying earlier about our technical colleges losing money on educating. I mean, that seems like that would be a great place to put our money, if you would, if we have money.
So they're probably a little bit different populations. So I think, and I just had this conversation with the technical college system because they do have programs. I think people, the example that's used most often is like, why do they have so many cosmetology programs when we need nurses? And we actually talked about this. I talked about this with the commissioner last week of those programs make money and it helps them offer the nursing program, right? So they continue to offer, kind of, you've got loss leaders and vice versa, that those programs, the more they offer, it helps them pay for the others, so the technical colleges probably isn't the same. I mean, probably they do have some faculty constraints, but it's probably more within the four-year university setting and other programs where we need to get folks stepping up from, and I always get the order of credentials wrong. Sorry, y'all, I'm the only non-clinician here, but from an RN to leave the bedside where they're making good money to become a faculty member. Like that's at that level, which is where the real constraint is what my understanding is.
Yeah, and I can't remember which slide it is, but there is a slide here that talks about like a loan forgiveness for postgraduate nurses and that sort of thing. So I think, tax incentives, because some of us have paid off our loans, took forever, but we did it. And so I think there's an opportunity there, but building the pipeline is essential. And the other one, I believe, was slide 39. Incentives for healthcare education faculty to increase the number of instructors. So they kind of go hand in hand, and looking, to make sure that we're being competitive in our rates.
And many of these slides are not necessarily included as things that we're adopting or recommending, but it's much of what, just inclusion of what we heard as concepts and ideas.
Yeah.
So don't necessarily take these as.
Yeah, and like I said, I think they're kind of coinciding, trying to say the same thing.
Yep.
I just didn't want to leave that space out when we're looking at final consideration. And then I do just want to absolutely say de-escalation. I don't remember which slide it was, but for the mental health de-escalation for all healthcare workers.
Okay.
I believe that will help with the workplace violence. And then we have the workplace violence reporting hotline or outreach hotline. It sounds like it's almost like, hey, I'm having a situation, help me with my mental health, but is there also a way for reporting to say, hey, this occurred, even if it's an anonymous, like this is what's happening at my institution, some type of anonymous reporting so that we can get support and help in those spaces as well.
So here's where I think we are. We've got some minor tweaks to, I think, what we've shown today, but I think it sounds like we're largely on the right track. We've got a little bit more, a couple places I want to get more specific, and I want to fix a couple of things that I think we need to correct our understanding on from today. I am still very optimistic that between now and December 31, you will have back in your emails what should be final version of both slide deck for ease of consumption and a slightly more robust report, but still fairly high level, with what we hope will be final set of recommendations, and then some additional follow-up, like we talked about, of ongoing work that folks that this group would want someone to pick up and to continue to carry the ball on. And then we may be asked for more information on some of these, or we may not. People will say, we got it. I know that there is some work in process on some things related, at least a little bit, to some of these already. Folks are interested. And so we'll see where we go. I think I will probably draft at least some sort of transmission letter, cover letter with the report. I'll certainly share that with all of y'all. I would ask that if you're comfortable and supportive to sign on to that with me. This is not your last opportunity for comment. If you have thoughts, I have actually a couple questions for a few of you afterwards, but that I'll track you down on. But if you have other thoughts after today, or even after you get that final report, we'll try to still have a couple days built in after that for any like showstopper comments. I can't thank y'all enough. Well, and look, I will say, after every meeting we have, we do get questions and additional information sent to the inbox that we're trying to share and consume. So who knows what we'll get today, but I can't thank y'all enough for your participation. This is no small task, right? We knew that going in, and there is no easy or quick fix, but I think you guys have done remarkable work of being engaged and considering all the different aspects and all the different factors of all the different sectors of the industry to come together with some both cross-cutting recommendations and then a couple specifics that I hope will see some action on, hopefully. So I can't thank you enough. And I've enjoyed being out around the state with all of you in your communities and in different areas of the state, and had the fortunate opportunity to see some of your facilities, and hopefully I can do that again, continuing on after this. So thank you. Thank you for folks that showed up in public and online today. Pause for any parting comments before we adjourn. Sean, any housekeeping from you?
No, not really. I just do want to say this. You guys have been just absolutely wonderful to work with. I really appreciate your cooperation, your responsiveness. I've learned so much from each one of you guys, and I can't wait to see this final report. I think you guys have done a great job in addressing these challenges and identifying these opportunities. So just thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to work with you guys on this. And of course, you'll hear from me 100%. So just be on the lookout.
Thank you all very much. Happy holidays, and you'll get something from us.
That's right.